I'll ask us to adopt a meditation posture. This can be mental, if not physical, or both, of course. The idea is to compose the mind, to bring it inward. And then I'm going to ask Michael to lead the refuge prayer while we contemplate the refuge objects in the space in front in visualization, and feel that we are going for refuge on behalf of all sentient beings whom we see behind us. We're acting as their ambassador, their representative. So Michael, could you recite the refuge prayer and generating bodhichitta prayer? Same.
I go for refuge until enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha for the benefit of all.
So maintaining our meditational composure, we're going to motivate for the session ahead, utilizing Lama Zopa Rinpoche's words from his book, Transforming Problems into Happiness. So just consider, whenever afflictions come to me, whether from beings or inanimate objects, if my mind gets used to perceiving only the suffering or the negative aspects, then even the smallest incident will have the capacity to generate great pain. Contemplate. It is in the nature of indulging in any concept, whether suffering or happiness, that the experience of this happiness or suffering will be thereby intensified. Just contemplating how this is true in our experience. As the negative experience gradually becomes stronger, a time will come when most of what appears to you will become the cause of bringing you an unhappiness. And happiness will never have a chance to arise. If I do not realize that the fault lies within my own mind's way of gaining experience, and if I blame external conditions alone, then the ceaseless flame of negative deeds such as hatred and suffering will increase. This is called all appearances arising in the form of the enemy. Just consider how, through examination, this is true of our own experience. We embellish negative actions, they become stronger as a consequence, or appear stronger, until they pervade our perception, it seems, of everything. Everything appears to be negative, a problem, an overwhelming difficulty. It all somehow becomes too much for us to bear. So, Lama Zopa Rinpoche is inviting us to consider the role, the pivotal role
Done period, and you are now co-host period.
that our mind has in producing this very scenario. Rinpoche says, and contemplate, you should thoroughly understand that the reason living beings in the quarreling age are afflicted by suffering is fundamentally related to the weakness of their discriminative mind. Thus, being invincible against obstacles such as enemies, illnesses, and harmful spirits does not mean that you can drive them away so that they will not recur. We know it's vain to even consider this possibility from our own experience. We know this. Rather, it means that they will not be able to arise as obstacles in the path to enlightenment. In order to succeed, to use suffering as a support of the path, I must train myself in the following two ways. I must reject the state of mind of exclusively desiring not to have suffering, and I must develop the attitude of being happy that suffering arises. So these two transformed or transforming attitude take us to the very heart of the thought transformation practice. So feeling that we're going to do this practice and spend time together with the purpose of working to benefit others, we can generate Amitabha Buddha on the crown of our heads, facing the same direction as ourselves. Visualize Amitabha is seated on a sun and a moon disk, one face, two arms, two legs, seated in the meditative posture of equipoise, with palms cradling a bowl of nectar in his lap. Amitabha is wearing the robes of a renunciate. His majestic body is composed of radiant light. At his crown is a white Om. At his throat, a red A. And at his heart, a blue Hung. Now we contemplate this visualization while reciting the 8 verses of training the mind, but we are seeking Amitabha's blessings to develop in our heart the aspiration that will be actually able to accomplish the welfare, the highest welfare of all sentient beings. And we do this due to recognizing their great value and how we rely upon them. With determination to achieve the highest aim for the benefit of all sentient beings, which surpasses even the wish-fulfilling gem, may I hold them dear at all times. Whenever I interact with someone, may I view myself as the lowest of all, and from the very depths of my heart, respectfully hold others as superior. In all my deeds, may I probe into my mind, and as soon as mental and emotional afflictions arise, as they endanger myself and others, may I strongly confront them and avert them. When I see beings of unpleasant character, oppressed by strong negativity and suffering, may I hold them dear, for they are rare to find, as if I have discovered a jewel treasure. When others, out of jealousy, treat me wrongly with abuse, slander, and scorn, may I take upon myself the defeat and offer to others the victory. When someone whom I have helped or in whom I have placed great hope mistreats me in extremely hurtful ways, may I regard him still as my precious teacher. In brief, may I offer benefit and joy to all my mothers, both directly and indirectly. May I quietly take upon myself all hurts and pains of my mothers. May all this remain undefiled by the stains of the 8 mundane concerns. And may I recognize all things as illusion, devoid of clinging, thereby be released from bondage. So, by contemplating the 8 verses, and due to recognizing how sentient beings are extremely precious, we develop within ourselves the very deepest level, the definite determination. May I, at all times, hold them close and dear, and at all times see them as most precious. So we can expand this wish in our own way, reaching out to touch the welfare of all other beings. And we conclude this part of the aspiration by strongly requesting Guru Amitabha, please bless my mind to be able to do this. Having made this request, visualize blessings in the form of light rays and nectar descending from the 3 places of Amitabha Buddha. Light rays in the form of nectar descend from the crown, throat, and heart syllables. These light rays merge and enter us as nectar through the crown. As it does so, it purifies our body, speech, and mind, and blesses us so that we might transform these 3 spheres into the enlightened body, speech, and mind of Amitabha Buddha. And it's on this basis that we feel that we become inseparable from Amitabha Buddha. So we'll leave Amitabha Buddha in this position and begin the session. So we'll remember to absorb Amitabha Buddha. We all had Amitabha Buddha with us all week, if you remember, because I didn't absorb the visualization at the end of last week's session. So we'll complete the meditation there. But this is actually perfectly all right, because as Geshe Doga explained on one occasion, when we visualize, for example, Lama Tsongkhapa on the crown of our head as the epitome, the manifestation of our personal guru, it's very, very powerful, Geshe Doga suggested, to feel that Lama Tsongkhapa is there witnessing our actions throughout the day. And he said this will have a definite effect, because when we're about to perform a negative action, it's suddenly thrown into sharp relief. You know, it's juxtaposed acutely against virtue, the pure infant virtue represented by the visualization. And so we're suddenly made vividly conscious that to perform an action on that kind of degraded basis, that self-seeking basis, would be a failure of our practice. And likewise, if we start to have a glimmer of a positive thought by visualizing that the guru visualized on our crown is there, witnessing that, we can develop this internal momentum, this intensity to really, really, really expand that positive thought. So it becomes inseparable from our daily character, our daily nature. So we can alternatively absorb Amitabha Buddha, who's not, of course, distinct from Tsongkhapa and Shakyamuni Buddha. We're not seeing any separation here. But if we were to absorb Amitabha Buddha, we bring the visualization down into the body, into the heart, and then enter a state of sort of blissful unification and just sit in that state of deep relaxation. And so we'll actually do that formally at the end of the session as part of our dedication. So returning to the subject of the verses themselves, and in particular to verse 3, so I'm stepping back a little bit quite deliberately. Verse 3, which says, during all my activities, I will probe my mind, and as soon as an affliction arises, since it endangers both myself and others, I shall train myself to confront it directly and avert it. So Tsongkhapa says, if in battle your sword was to fall from your hand, you would, without hesitation, immediately retrieve it out of fear for your life. Likewise, when you battle the afflictions and lose the weapon of mindfulness, which does not forget the subjective and objective aspects of engaging in what is to be adopted and rejecting what is to be cast aside, you must immediately reapply mindfulness out of fear of falling into the lower realms. End of quote. So it's a very powerful analogy that Tsongkhapa's in picturing, if you like, there. And it's inviting us, requesting us, urging us to develop that keenness of mindfulness, that sort of concern to be mindful, so that we don't allow ourselves to drop into a state where we can generate powerful negative minds. And more than that, foster them and bring them to completion in some destructive way, because it's these negativities that will cast us into the lower realms, create great suffering. So the great protector Nagarjuna, in his friendly letter, also taught the importance of mindfulness. And this quote's also given in Tsongkhapa's text. The verse reads, O Lord, the Siddhartha declared mindfulness of the body to be the one path to follow. Hold fast to it and guard it. When mindfulness declines, all virtues perish. End of quote. So these are very pertinent verses you'll recognize immediately in relation to our verse 3. So I thought just to be a little bit more formal to give concise definitions of what's involved here. And this definition of mindfulness that I'm going to present, which is a classic definition, is also perhaps somewhat startling from a Western popular cultural point of view. And I mention that because the word mindfulness is bandied around with increasing freedom, and in some ways maybe losing its precise edge, at least in terms of its classical significance within the Buddhist psychological cosmology. So it's very good, I think, very useful to return to these precise definitions so that we can begin to pare away all those layers of superimposed ideas and expectations and even ideological constructions that are made that for that poor word mindfulness to bear. So mindfulness is a mental factor that does not forget a familiar object and repeatedly brings it to mind. So I'll recite that again. Mindfulness is a mental factor that does not forget a familiar object and repeatedly brings it to mind. So this not forgetting of an object that's already familiar is critical to understanding mindfulness. It apprehends what it is, it acknowledges what it is that we've already apprehended, but it brings it to mind again in the next moment. And it's that recalling of awareness of the object from moment to moment that provides the continuum of awareness that is mindfulness. In that continuum, we don't lose contact with the object because it's being consistently and carefully re-invoked, recalled, re-invited into our current moment of awareness. And we know this is true because the very instant we let our mindfulness lapse, which of course is the very instant that we forget to remember the object that we're attempting to remember again, is the very juncture of losing the object and of going off on some other path. So it's this cohesion that mindfulness allows of our experience of an object that serves, according to the definition, as a basis for concentration. Mindfulness repeatedly brings to mind a phenomenon of previous acquaintance without forgetting it. It does not allow the mind to be distracted from the object and is therefore the basis of concentration. So this kind of mindfulness isn't just something that's confined to the strict sort of formal meditational setting. It's something that we carry with us in our daily life. It's the holding of that sword of awareness that Tsongkhapa's talking about. So we must continuously concentrate on being aware of holding the sword in our hand. Otherwise, we drop it. And it's exactly the same when we're holding the mind of virtue, for example, particularly in its germinal beginning stages, that we must continuously hold it from moment to moment in order to even have the opportunity of growing it, cultivating it, and developing it. And likewise, of course, it's the mind of virtue that will oppose the beginning of the generation of a negative mind that is going to enable us to get on top of the generation of that negative mind as it begins to unfurl. The moment we lose our mindfulness of that task of somehow opposing the generation of the negative thought that's arising or the negative impulse, we open the door to that impulse taking over and controlling us. We forget our virtuous capacity and we surrender to the mind of anger. Anger is a perfect example. It needn't only be anger. But we're now in the hands of anger. Anger is boss. Anger is ruling. So that's because we've allowed mindfulness to lapse. However, it's necessary to add another ingredient here to this scenario in order to really get to the essence of what's being presented. We must also accompany that mindfulness with a mind that we can call vigilance or conscientiousness. And this is defined as Conscientiousness is a mental factor that cherishes the accumulation of positive actions and guards the mind against that which gives rise to the afflictions. In dependence on diligence, it thus familiarizes the concomitant main mind and other mental factors with virtue and guards it from non-virtue. And so to make that a little bit more real to us, we consider that in guarding the mind, vigilance in some ways is similar to shame and awareness of self-respect and consideration for others, except that it is not based on a particular reason. So in an experience of shame, something's happened, we're embarrassed by it, and we wish to step away from that because it's painful to contemplate. And so there's a very specific incident that's occurred that has generated that moment of shame, and in this case, loss of self-respect. However, vigilance is much more open than that. It's universally accessing our state of mind, which is being supported by mindfulness, so that it will be able to pick up, detect in an instant, with great precision, the moment that the inkling of a negative thought gets underway or a negative impulse gets underway. So it's the guard that will detect the enemy entering the room through the door of a loss of mindfulness, if you like. So we need a combination of mindfulness and vigilance. They need to work together as a team. And so in this way, if we can cultivate these very, very precious minds, we can prevent the main mind from manufacturing all sorts of powerfully destructive and limiting scenarios. And fortunately, with mindfulness and vigilance in place as well, we can cultivate even infinitely virtuous minds. So it's not in itself kind of constricted. It can open out beneficially to supporting positive experiences, or it can jump in powerfully to thwart negative experiences with equal ease. So this is what I meant by it somehow more universal. So vigilance and mindfulness are necessarily needing to work together. So we must interlock them. The moment we fail to do this, we will neither see the need nor recognize the opportunity to practice thought transformation. Especially, I'm emphasizing, especially when difficult and confronting situations arise. So Geshe Chekawa's instruction in his commentary to this verse says, training ourselves to examine our mental continuum in all our activities and averting the afflictions as soon as they arise is as follows. Whichever of the four everyday activities we engage in, with mindfulness and vigilance, we should analyze whether thoughts such as attachment arise in our mind. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many of the other Tibetan masters of this tradition emphasize in relation to this verse, it's a call, a clarion call to us to overcome procrastination. This is, I think, bears a lot of thought. Procrastination is that mind which says to us, let's take time out and see whether the situation resolves itself on its own, by itself. Meanwhile, why not take a walk or have a cup of tea? So we've got a mind generation happening that has great potential to be disturbing for both ourselves and others, and it has a great capacity to create negative karmic imprints, which will have an impact on the way our potential unfurls or doesn't unfurl in the future. And therefore, we're opening the door to that possibility by having forgotten mindfulness and vigilance together. We have procrastinated. We've decided it's not necessary to be right there with the moment and right there to do something about it. We've prevaricated. We've procrastinated. We've even wandered away from that task. So His Holiness gives a very poignant example in his commentary, Transforming the Mind. It has various covers, but it's an actual concise, amongst other things, commentary on the 8 verses. And he mentions that probably one of the most important aspects of understanding this verse is recognizing that even the smallest non-virtuous mind generation is to be taken very seriously as a Buddhist practitioner. And it's precisely those smaller examples of non-virtuous mind generation that we tend to think, oh, I got a little bit upset today, but it doesn't really matter. And off we go. We don't actually engage in any serious remedy or contemplation about what might be better done in that scenario, because we don't regard that moment of generating a negative mind as sufficiently significant to apply any form of antidote or remedy. And so this is procrastination. This is putting off doing what must be done. And there's no justification for that, because it shows a lack of comprehension as to the way in which the law of cause and effect operates. And so our understanding of karma is critical here. So karma's not been looked at as deterministically here. It's not a force that we're somehow in. It's intimately connected to the way we're behaving. That's the whole point to consider. So we might say that mindfulness and vigilance are requesting us to observe the law of cause and effect skillfully, so that as we get the inkling of a positive state of mind with mindfulness and vigilance, we protect that mind as the most precious thing, and we seek to expand it, to strengthen it, to apply it to more objects. We move from the friend to the stranger to the enemy and embrace them all with equal love, for example. And likewise, we do the same when we see a mind of antipathy, a mind that's wishing to reject or repulse other beings because it's somehow going to impinge on me, my happiness, and it immediately undoes the momentum of that mind right there on the spot, because we're paying attention, acutely paying attention. So the reality is, as we know, we can and do create powerful negative actions in a flash. And the consequences will certainly follow, but they mightn't happen in a flash as consequences. They may happen further down the track. And it's this kind of delay, if you like, in the way in which the law of cause and effects works that can seduce us mistakenly into bargaining with karma. Oh, look, I got away with that. I stole money from my friend for my next drug deal, but they're rich. They've got a good income. They won't really mind. And therefore, we move on. So that kind of pattern of behavior is deeply problematic, as you could imagine. So Shantideva invites us to identify the real enemy. Shantideva says, this enemy of mine, the afflictions, is long-lived, with neither beginning nor end. No other enemies can endure in this manner for so long. End of quote. So Geshe Chekwa, in his commentary to the 8 verses, says, when we concede to our conventional enemies, they no longer harm us and can even benefit us. But if we assuage the afflictions in the same manner, however, they become even more destructive. This is very, very crucial. So Shantideva says, if you relate to your enemies with friendship and gifts, these bring benefit and happiness. However, if you appease the afflictions, it causes even more suffering and injury. So to sum all this up, Geshe Chekwa invites us as beginners to observe our conduct first. And this is because we, as beginners, need to recognize the weakness of our antidotes and the difficulty those antidotes have encountering afflictions that have already arisen. So we need to look at this experientially again. We know that strong jealousy is arising. Once we've really let that jealousy spread its wings and take flight, it's very, very difficult to step backward and see the situation without that jealousy dominating it. It's pervaded the landscape in the same way that was described earlier in our motivation, seeing all things as our enemy, if you like. So Geshe Chekwa says, since whatever meditative practice we undertake from amongst the 3 scopes becomes a remedy against all the afflictions, it is appropriate to engage in this practice of observing our conduct first. If we don't observe our conduct first, who is? We're right there with our conduct. We're the ones producing it. We're the ones who are responsible for it. We have to at least start there. Secondly, Geshe Chekwa says we need meditation because each antidote is said to have its corresponding, each affliction said to have its corresponding antidote. And so since whatever meditative practice we undertake from amongst the 3 scopes becomes a remedy against all the afflictions, it's appropriate to engage in this practice. So meditation is an opportunity to spend time reworking our habitual scenarios so that when we're in the thrust and chaos of our everyday lives, with everything going on, we have greater opportunity to make skillful discernments and adjustments, and in order to begin to transform our experience in positive ways. But there's a third level we need to also incorporate, which is that of wisdom. And Geshe Chekwa says that as our mind practice develops, since afflictions are devoid of objects, it is sufficient simply to recognize that this is so. Thus, there remains nothing to eliminate. This is going to lead us later into the very profound 8th verse of the 8 verses, where it says, by ensuring that all this remains undefiled from the stains of the 8 worldly concerns, and by understanding all things as illusions, I will train myself to be free of the bondage of clinging. So here we recognize that the afflictions themselves, which appear so prominently real and powerful, are in fact not established there with their own essence from their own side at all. They are projections of our own deluded minds. So if we can transform those deluded minds themselves, the objects of our delusions collapse. They disintegrate. They no longer have a foundation to be sustained, let alone cultivated and taken as powerful and real. So Shanti Deva says, afflictions, relinquish them with our eyes of insight. And so we need a combination of observing our conduct, engaging in meditation, and engaging in wisdom to really develop our thought transformation techniques. So this need to train with a very special focus, a kind of cultivated specialness of focus, seamlessly leads us into the next verse, which invites us to train ourselves to regard beings of unpleasant character and those oppressed by powerful negative karma and suffering with special care and as something rarely found. So the 4th verse in Thupten Jinpa's translation reads, when I encounter beings of unpleasant character and those oppressed by intense negative karma and suffering, as though finding a treasure of precious jewels, I'll train myself to cherish them, for they are so rarely found. So this verse, interestingly and very significantly, can be placed under a heading, a banner heading, which is a call to compassion. It's an invitation to develop compassion. So I'm going to ask the question, why is finding someone of unpleasant character, encountering them, for example, to be seen as like discovering a precious, rarely found jewel? Has anyone got any ideas I'd like to offer or contribute? Is it something we do easily? What do we do? Now, how do we view this situation? And we might say straight up that a being of unpleasant character can be the product of many mechanisms, projective mechanisms from our own side. So we can go into that in a little bit more detail, but I'd like just your initial response to the verse and the challenge of it. What are your thoughts?
Can you please repeat what the verse was, kindly?
Yes, of course. When I encounter beings of unpleasant character and those oppressed by intense negative karma and suffering, as though finding a treasure of precious jewels, I'll train myself to cherish them, for they are so rarely found. So Scarlett, thank you.
I tend to avoid, uh, which I need to learn, um, how to see them as like my precious teacher. I think I tend to have an aversion, just because I feel like the energy exchange between that person and me affects my energy. So when
Mhm.
I find someone like that, yeah, I tend to, because their attitudes tend to be quite negative, so I just tend to avoid it, which is not good.
It's a very honest, what's the word for it? Presentation of how we do experientially relate, isn't it? When we see something unpleasant, I notice, when there are so-called beggars on the street, uh, it's amazing to watch the flow of shoppers as they encounter the person sitting there. And you see a whole array of responses, but I think the most common one is avoidance. People go click, beggar, and then quick, click, shutter. And they will even physically walk around that person in order not to see them, if you like, in order not to encounter them. So this is an example which is found in the commentaries too. And Geshe Chekwa talks about lepers as well. So in historical sort of India, leprosy was, and I still think to some extent is an issue. And it causes very, very significant disfiguration. That the shedding of skin is so acute that it goes back and digits are lost and knuckles are, bones. It's just an incredibly difficult condition. And so, can we look at that person with that condition? Can we? This is the question, with open eyes and open heart, or do our defense mechanisms kick in? So, having said that, I think Scarlett's raising a very important point as well, which is one of capability or capacity. And it is suggested in the teachings that if we meet a being of very unpleasant nature and we don't find that we have the capacity to transform that situation so that we recognize them as a precious jewel and hug them, sort of treasure them, it is okay not to engage. But that not engagement, and this is critical, isn't a forfeiting of our concern to benefit and treasure that person at some point when we are able to. We're not dropping them out of our field of responsibility at all. We're simply saying that at the moment, I don't feel that I've got the capacity to do that. And therefore, I'll leave it for the moment. This is skillful means. But the critical difference is that we're not abandoning them in our heart. We're just acknowledging our own limitation at that moment. So Scarlett's got her hand raised again. Scarlett?
What I was wondering is, like, if yes, you don't have that capacity at the moment, could you
Mm,
say like a blessing or a mantra or a prayer to that person? Um, because like if we are under the lens of bodhichitta, right?
mm,
We work to benefit all, and we, look at others with a responsibility for caring, but with this person, of this verse, like you said, if you just don't have the capacity for it, is that a way to
absolutely.
kind of
And
care?
Exactly. I think, that again, it's very, very important sort of reflection that you're raising. The idea is to still take responsibility, which is what you're suggesting. And
Yeah.
you're proposing, you could say, a prayer, for example. But that prayer is a basis of virtue in a wonderful way. And if we dedicate that basis of virtue at that moment towards actually looking after that very person in the future, in whatever way would be most advantageous, most skillful, and most beneficial for that person, may this be so due to making this prayer right now. And so we use the material of the base of the mind of virtue that's arising as a form of aspiration and dedication, which then seals the karma of that encounter for that fruit to arise at a future time. And so we're not at all idle or being fanciful in such a response. This is a really vital way of practicing thought transformation. Meanwhile, of course, in reality, there's going to be someone else sitting there the next time you turn the corner. It doesn't take very long to encounter yet another person of unpleasant character. It may even be the person we're going home to after we've been out shopping because they've forgotten to do something or somehow done something that we didn't want to happen, and we find ourselves getting upset. And so beings of unpleasant nature are manifesting all over the place. And so there are so many opportunities in so many different ways to seek to engage in thought transformation in the best way. And there's always going to be some very hard cases where it doesn't work at the moment. And there'll be other cases where, yes, we can. And so we're training our mind. We're practicing to develop that magnanimous sense of responsibility in each and every situation. And therefore we engage with relish the experiences that are unfolding, because that's precisely the coalface of our opportunity to practice and transform. So I find it's almost as though the moment we think we've got everything settled down is precisely when the unpleasant character person manifests in all their splendor, isn't it? Suddenly there they are. Oh dear, I thought I was handling my anger really well, but this is something different. Look what you just said to me, kind of thing. And so therefore, that's an incredible opportunity to determine the extent or the measure of our mind transformation. And so we relish that opportunity to practice. So it's a real opportunity to practice. But this opportunity must be viewed in a deeper way. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, to transform problems into happiness, it is not sufficient to see that problems help your practice of virtue. This alone is not enough. You must clearly recognize that your problems are actually necessary conditions for your practice of virtue. And you can derive continual, stable happiness from this. So I'll repeat that. This alone is not enough. You must clearly recognize that your problems are actually necessary conditions for your practice of virtue, and you can derive continual, stable happiness from this. Kabje Zopa Rinpoche adds, during difficult times, remember that your problems are benefiting you immensely by allowing you to achieve not only temporal happiness, but also happiness in future lives and the ultimate happiness of enlightenment. Even though your problem may be very heavy and difficult to bear, remember that they are the most joyful things to have because they benefit you continuously. This is incredibly challenging, but also wondrous to contemplate, isn't it? That we might realign our habitual ways of doing and being in this way. So Kabje Rinpoche says in Transforming Problems into Happiness, as long as you see something as a problem and allow it to irritate you, you cause that problem to disturb your mind. While this is happening, there is no way to transform the suffering into Dharma practice. But when you are able to stop seeing problems as problems, you are able to use suffering in your Dharma practice. Problems actually enable you to generate and increase your good karma. They become the cause of happiness. So if we sort of consider Rinpoche's words here, we see that there's a great significance in saying that there is no way to transform that suffering into Dharma practice sometimes, because they seem to be overwhelming. But if we can generate and develop an attitude that no longer sees problems as problems, we are then able to use suffering as our Dharma practice. So this is the great challenge being opened up here. And so for this reason, Lama Zopa Rinpoche spends a lot of energy and time in his commentary on thought transformation in inviting us to relabel problems as non-problems or as opportunities to practice. And this very relabeling, this reassigning, this re-symbolization, this reconstruction of that apparently independently real problem as a problem gives us the scope to begin to work with the various ingredients that are forming that problem's apparent impervious strength and autonomy. We begin to break down its capacity to stand there unaffected by a mental change. Scarlett?
Thank you. I have that book surprisingly, and I don't know how I got it, but I remember I'm looking at my cabinet right now, and
Yeah.
I read it a while ago. You have spoke about antidotes, and I just want to kindly request a practical way to transform my mind. Today I was speaking with my friend, and yes, I think we all have things that we have to process and go through on the daily. And so today, like jealousy came up in a conversation with my friend. I think because I'm going through something that she doesn't have to go through. And so how do I use that energy of jealousy to not feel, sorry for myself, or not say, oh, it's my bad karma, ripening. This is why, this is all happening. How do I transform my mind when jealousy comes up?
It's a very great question, isn't it? And there are many, many techniques proposed for working with the mind of jealousy. But I think for me, the deepest way of working with that is to acknowledge through careful observation of ourselves the manner in which our construction of who and what we expect to be is the foundation of the mind of jealousy arising. Because when that external personal situation has the apparent capacity to reflect our failure or our inability to reach that goal or that outcome that we've envisaged for ourselves, that's precisely where jealousy gets up and running. The reality is that we're never going to be able to be that other person. Everyone has different and mixed experiences and opportunities. And so the self-cherishing attitude doesn't look at things like that. It constructs the world differently. It says that everything and everyone out there is only as significant or as beneficial as their role in apparently serving me. And that focus of me is dominating our awareness of others. If we have love, and this is the solution for jealousy, is love and joy. Because if someone else has suddenly received something that they really want, a bodhisattva's response is joy. How wonderful that they've received that. They've become a doctor of philosophy, whereas my thesis was rejected, or whatever it is that's happened. So rather than feeling jealous, we experience delight in their happiness, in their achievement. And we know this for children or dependents as well, that it's wonderful to have delight in their achievements. And to do otherwise is to thwart or to block the circumstances for that child or that person to flourish, because we're somehow impinging on it. And so there's a lack of compassion in that scenario, because self-cherishing doesn't want to embrace the reality of that other person. And so the very foundation of generating a mind of jealousy, and it can be a twinge or a pang or whatever, is a unique opportunity to look at the way in which self-cherishing feeds off those deluded minds in a very perverse and destructive way. It flourishes through jealousy, anger, attachment, and so forth. There, it's very staple of existence. And so that is therefore an invitation to wish that person happiness and joy. We're reminded by our incipient mind of jealousy that's arising, oh, wait a minute, how wonderful you've got what you wanted. I'm so happy for you. Is there anything I can do to make it even better? So you forget yourself in that scenario. And the self that you're forgetting is the self-cherishing self. Because as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says, and Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, all the Lamas say, in serving the needs of the other, you are benefiting yourself in spontaneous corollary. You're benefiting yourself because you're not seeking to exclusively benefit yourself. It happens as a natural outcome of cherishing others. This takes us to the very essence of the thought transformation technique again. We can, in a way, defuse our concern for a self-cherishing self and relax a bit, and instead try to generate virtuous minds. And as we do so, we begin to see positive aspects in situations that formerly appeared negative. This is what Rinpoche is talking about in transforming the appearance of that negative object so that it no longer appears as an enemy anymore. So in other words, the pang of jealousy that you've described is a unique opportunity to engender a joyous happiness for the welfare and delight of achievement of that person. And then to move on with a light touch, a light step. His Holiness uses this wonderful phrase in here of moving with a light step. I found that really, really beautiful to consider, that if we have these thought transformation techniques in experiential sort of engagement, we can step very lightly through circumstances. Not lightly in that they're trivial, but we're no longer burdened by the need to somehow consume all our experience according to the lens of our self-cherishing mind. So the enemy is not the self, talking generally here, or the person, it's the self-cherishing that is a sort of deformed structure that we've produced through deluded minds themselves. That can all be let go of. And then the full capacity that we have as a person can be somehow freed and revealed, as it can with the person who might have somehow inadvertently triggered a moment of jealousy. Hope that sort of goes towards an answer there. Has anyone else got any remedies or suggestions? Because we all have experiences similar, don't we?
My remedy is always happiness, always joy. The first time that it's just, oh my God, I'm so happy for you. That's amazing. To just and also remember that they have worked very, very hard to achieve this, and I think often, at least in the Western world, we think or we blame deities, like a god, and God gave them this. How come God didn't give this to me? And I have to remind myself that no, if I want that, I need to work very hard for it, and I should be very happy that they've worked so hard for it. That helps me tremendously, and and then the micromanager who gives to some and not to others. So.
In relation to, we might move on to the next verse. No, I'll just say a few other things. With the unpleasant character, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as does Geshe Chekwa in his commentary on this verse, points out to social structures, or in structuration, if you want to be more sort of technical, such as the operation of a caste system. In other words, the ways in which various forms of prejudice operate to separate ourselves from closeness and concern for others. And I think this bears a great deal of thought. And I couldn't help myself from thinking about the state of politics in America at the moment. With an incredible bipartisan battle that's going on, that's threatening the very stability, you'd have to say, of American democracy. And the rest of the world's watching with some amazement at these processes, but also with some humility, because we can recognize that our own cultures have the same capacity. And so racial prejudice, sexual prejudice, performative prejudice, the sense of, I mentioned a few talks ago that in Australia, the non-hearing community are fighting the legal system by going to the Supreme Court to demand the right to sit on juries. Everyone else is obligated legally to attend jury service, but the so-called deaf are excluded on the basis that they can't hear. And they're saying, but we do hear, we hear differently. We might need signing and various other forms, but we're fully compass, we're fully engaged, we're fully aware, and we're completely moral citizens who have a vested interest in participating in our cultural juridical practices. How can we be excluded? And so these are examples of distancing and excluding through unexamined or insufficiently examined projections about what a person is and isn't. And so Geshe Chekwa mentions skin color. he doesn't sort of mention racism per se, but how do these things operate? You know, they operate by jumping off what is a mere superficial notation, if you like, of difference, and then embellishing that to become a description of an entire person's worth, in the case of racism, or lack of worth for that matter. But not only that, but the entire people's lack of worth. So it happens on both direct one-to-one and on sort of more globalized, universalized scale. And so the thought transformation practices are trying or inviting us to tear away the veils of projective prejudice that are blocking us from apprehending who is out there, who's actually there. And I think there's, for me, a great, incredible depth of meaning here for the way we might proceed in our own social world, if you like. So, yeah, it's in his commentary. I've written here in my notes. Geshe Chekwa actually alerts us to the fact that this verse is also concerning the very manner in which we do indeed typecast and judge people according to various systems of discrimination. So His Holiness on this verse says, we should think that in our actions, we should provide others with food, medicine, and the like, while our thoughts, with our thoughts, we should train ourselves to contemplate the following. Whatever suffering beings might have, may they ripen upon me. So His Holiness says that this verse relates to the special case of relating to people who are socially marginalized, perhaps because of their behavior, their experience, their destitution, or on account of some illness. But whoever practices bodhicitta, that's us, we're attempting to do this, must take special care of these people, as if on meeting them, you have found a real treasure. Instead of feeling repulsed, a true practitioner of these altruistic principles should engage and take on the challenge of relating. In fact, the way we interact with people could give a great impetus to our spiritual practice. And so this is the great challenge. So His Holiness at this point in his commentary eulogizes, applauds the work that Christians do in establishing welfare services that service people who might be considered disadvantaged in various ways. He says Christians who supply food and clothing to the homeless in our big cities, etc. So this is different from patronizing. This is the other question you might be thinking. If we're seeing people, oh, how wonderful, you're a destitute person, you're my special treasure, well, that could be interpreted in a grotesque way, couldn't it? That we're actually relishing the opportunity of coming upon someone who's without resources, gives us a chance to practice virtue. That would be a sick way of interpreting this at all. There's no patronization involved at all. There's no judgment involved at all, because we recognize that that person is equal to ourselves. Exactly. No other work has to be done to come to that conclusion. That is something we've already concluded in the first step of our aspiration to develop the mind, engaging mind of bodhicitta, which is a recognition of the equality and self and others. Without that recognition as the very foundation of our practice of altruism, we don't stand any chance of developing a universal concern for others. So Geshe Chekwa says, we must not treat them as our enemies, saying we cannot even bear to look at them, and we must never allow them to come near us. Rather, we should feel compassion as though they were being led away by the king's executioners. Even if some among them are morally degenerate, we should feel, what can I do to help them until our tears flow freely? So Thupten Jinpa, in his important, in fact, wondrous translation of the entire corpus of mind training texts in the sort of Tibetan tradition, called the Great Collection, says in his introduction, he relates the story in his introduction about Geshe Chekawa and the lepers. He says, there is a wonderful story about how mind training teaching became public in the early stages of its development. The 13th century master Sangye Gompa speaks of how Chekawa shared the mind training instructions first with individuals suffering from leprosy. Public censure of lepers was apparently a major social issue in central Tibet at the time. And Kadam teachers of this tradition, were deeply concerned about this. Legend has it that even Drom Tompa himself, one of the founding fathers of the Kadam school, devoted the latter part of his life to nursing lepers and eventually became himself a victim of the disease. As word spread about the mind training teaching within the leper community, more and more lepers gathered to hear Chekawa's teaching and engage in the practice, such that the teaching became known as the teaching for the lepers. Then Thupten Jinpa adds, perhaps it was the mind training instructions on how to arise above both fortune and misfortune and transform adversities into opportunities for spiritual growth that provided them with the much needed solace and strength to cope with their difficult life situation. So I think, that story says so much on its own. I don't need to comment. So we'll move now to verse 5. When others out of jealousy treat me wrongly with abuse and slander, I shall train to take the defeat upon myself and offer the victory to others. So I feel that we can obviously extrapolate the meanings that we've drawn from the last verse to this verse. But what does it mean, do you think, to say that we must train ourselves to take the defeat upon ourselves and to offer the victory to others? This is a challenging idea. What do we think it means? Or what problem do we have with what we think it might mean? Anyone like to share?
Maybe giving up the attachment.
Sorry, who's speaking?
Sorry, Sheila.
Sheila, thank you. Yeah.
Maybe by giving up the attachment and giving over the win to the other person, it will, well, you're not that attached to the win. You're not attached to that.
Mm-hmm.
Ross, I think for me, this is Michael. I think for me, it's one of those areas where, particularly in the West, we kind of think of everything as a pie. And if Shayla's going to get a bigger piece of that pie, that means I got to get a smaller piece.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really how life. That's not really how life is. Shayla can have a bigger piece because we can just make a bigger pie or make a whole new pie, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what this is when I see somebody else who has something. A lot of times we try to think, oh, it's being taken away from me. And for me, it's, if I say it's not, I'm so glad that she has that or he has that, then it doesn't take anything away from me. and I can offer that to them.
So that decision to offer it to them is a technique, isn't it, to undo the convulsive mind that's seeking to keep the best for ourselves. So I'm thinking, you find yourself, cutting up a cake. It's always a good example, isn't it? And you think, if I give the biggest slice to you, I'm going to have the smaller slice left. I really like this cake. And because I'm the one cutting it and I'm the one serving it, why don't I keep the biggest slice for myself? In the very moment of generating that thought, how wonderful it would be if we immediately swapped the plates and took the biggest slice to that person with delight, and then happily ate smaller slices ourselves. In other words, it's the recognition of that mind generation of selfishness in this case, or greed, or whatever, that is triggering its opposite, giving the biggest slice to you so you can enjoy it. I'm delighted you have got the biggest slice. And so this is an example of mind training in action, because the apparent negative circumstance driven by our habitual responses has, because of mindfulness and vigilance, conscientiousness, been able to step in and immediately flip over that scenario into its opposite, caring for the other more than myself. And this is offering the victory to the other. Let them have it. Don't attempt to keep it. And so, as Shayla's saying, it's very much to do with attachment as well. We're overcoming the mind of attachment in giving away that piece of cake. So cake's sort of a comic example, but it's not always so comic, is it? How this works in daily life, because often we're trying to keep something very real for ourselves, exclusively for ourselves. So it can cut very deep. Does anyone else have any thoughts or suggestions or reflections around these ideas? I wanted to revisit from my side the story that I read out a couple of weeks ago. I used it to illustrate a particular point at the time, but I feel that it needs a little bit, it's worthy of more unpacking. And it's the story of Geshe Langpa Tangpa and the baby. And you might notice here that Geshe Langpa Tangpa, who's the subject of this story, is the author of the 8 verses. So this is a really good example of how the author himself behaved in reality. So I find this a fascinating thing to contemplate. So it's a wonderful story. Once, when the mendicant monk, Langri Tangpa, another mentor of advice, was delivering a discourse to thousands of disciples, a sickly child was born nearby. An astrologer told the mother that to save the infant's life, she must take it to a high spiritual master and claim it to be his child. Obediently, the mother brought the baby to Langri Tangpa in the middle of his teachings and declared before everyone that it was his. He happily accepted it and said, "For all of my lives you have been my child." Half the disciples lost faith and immediately walked away. They thought that it was the child, his child, of this lifetime. The rest of the audience stayed. At the end of the discourse, the mother presented the master with offerings and apologized by explaining the situation. Langri Tangpa, for his part, simply gave the child back. Throughout the entire scene, he maintained complete equanimity And for the half of the disciples who stayed, their faith remained unaffected. If anything, it grew even stronger. So Geshe Doga says, if this or any confrontation, talking about what we might draw from a story like this, is done with respect in our heart and without a loss of love and compassion, the results will be much more fruitful than if we fight with the intention of getting back at the person or wanting them to lose. So this is a possible habitual response, isn't it, of someone not as skillful as Geshe Langri Tangpa. He would have attempted to claw back his rapidly disappearing reputation as a virtuous celibate monk with spiritual realizations by somehow coming up with another interpretation of the scenario, and probably one that would involve putting the woman and her child down, declaring them unfit to give any form of testimony or make any claim of anything because they weren't fit people to even speak or whatever it is. I'm just sort of extrapolating here how it might be turned back on the so-called perpetrator of the problem. So the fact that Geshe Langri Tangpa did not, in fact, he utterly refused to give rise to even the inkling of such a defensive reply is a sign of his calm and compassionate capacity to simply accept the child as he was being asked. He simply accepted the child. And so I've called it a cosmological viewpoint, we might say that all beings are cherished children whom Geshe Langri Tangpa under no circumstances will abandon, irrespective of anything they might do or attempt to do. He will not abandon them. So, of course, this points to one of the great extraordinary qualities of enlightened compassion. It's not determined or predicated by having to like its object in the sense of seeing it as somehow more favorable than unfavorable to me. Its compassion is uncensored, unmitigated by those vagaries of difference. The concern of compassion is automatically there as the person manifests and appears in that compassionate being's experience. There's no time lag. There's no extra psychological work that has to be done to transform that situation of concern for that person, because spontaneously the person appears as precious to that compassionate being, even if they're standing there yelling abuse at me. So this is really a remarkable thing to contemplate. So likewise with the audience members who got up and left, a less sort of accomplished practitioner would have been concerned that they were losing their reputation. Their career was being destroyed as a spiritual teacher, and they would have attempted to clamber that back. But Geshe Langri Tangpa calmly went on with his discourse. And of course, a celibate monk, isn't expected to be having sexual intimacy, let alone bearing or impregnating people so that they bear children. But though from a worldly perspective, the scale and impact of what was happening there before the woman and the audience was somehow huge and potentially very damaging, at no juncture did concern for these kinds of worldly problems and outcomes disturb Geshe Langri Tampa's mind. Even a tremble of disturbance wasn't there. And this was because his mind was so full of love that he could accept everyone spontaneously. So I think this is, a very, very beautiful and very wonderful story, and has so much of value to consider. Now, there's one other aspect that I think deserves some treatment in this verse. I won't spend long on it, but it does say to offer the victory to others. So my question is, does this involve, and it's probably your question, surrendering to unjust circumstances in a passive way, just simply folding up and dying rather than somehow demanding your rights or fighting back? Doesn't mean that. This is an important point to consider. So what are your thoughts?
This is Shayla. I think that it would probably depend upon the situation.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't tell you what other situation. So I got to think some more about that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. But I mean, it's a very good answer, actually. It does depend on the situation. And that is actually the answer. Because His Holiness the Dalai Lama says exactly that we must judge situations by their merits. And if, for example, there is a situation where enabling someone else out there who's attempting to injure us, the victory of injuring us as they had planned, to accept that would be perhaps foolish, because it's not going to do anything at all beneficial for that person. And he says this is particularly the case when their action is going to affect the happiness of more than just me. So, for example, if we knew that someone was capable of violence in a relationship, we knew, and that person who is capable of violence leaves that particular person and moves on to another one, we're left with these sorts of moral questions, aren't we? Do we intimate or in some way delicately propose to that new person, that new potential partner, that there might be an issue here, a ground for some caution? So His Holiness says that we shouldn't abdicate responsibility, if you like, in situations. He doesn't give that particular example, but in these sorts of situations, it's responsible and skillful to take some act that is going to protect another person from harm. And so it's not contradicting the meaning of this verse. So this verse is giving a universal answer, but in reality, we have to be particular in the way that we navigate, which is exactly your point about looking at the circumstances in play. So I mention that because it's very, very important, because so many people, when they come into contact with the 8 verses, are impressed in some ways, but think it's demanding too much stuff that's going to somehow jeopardize my autonomy and my dignity. And therefore, it wouldn't be wise or skillful to attempt to employ these techniques. So it's very important. So I feel here we need to identify 2 approaches. One is a worldly approach, and these are points made by the Venerable Geshe Doga in his commentary. From a worldly point of view, if someone treats us badly, slanders and abuses us for no reason, then it is fitting to try and correct them. People would be sympathetic to that. In a worldly context, Someone who defends themselves when they are treated badly is considered a good person, a decent person who knows right from wrong. From a worldly perspective, the practical approach would be fitting. But for someone, this is the spiritual approach, for someone determined to achieve enlightenment for the sake of other beings and to develop love and compassion as a means to attain an awakened mind, the approach has to be different. The act of retaliation and returning harm would not be appropriate. If we were to do that, then we would have lost all opportunity to benefit that being. How can we benefit someone if we harm them? Our intention to benefit all sentient beings will be distorted and not be fulfilled. That is why the worldly approach is inappropriate. So we need, again, to be very thoughtful about how we interpret those two approaches, because they're not as separate as all that, actually, if we think about it more deeply. So His Holiness says, even though in the worldly way, it is proper to respond strongly to someone who is unjustifiably and has without reason accused you, it does not fit in with the practice of the altruistic spirit to enlightenment. It is incorrect to respond strongly unless there is a special purpose. If someone out of jealousy or out of dislikes treats me badly with abuse or even strikes me physically, then responding in kind, rather than responding in kind, you should suffer the defeat yourself and offer the others the victory. Does this seem unrealistic? This type of practice is very difficult indeed, but must be done by those who seek one pointedly to develop an altruistic mind. This does not mean that in the Buddhist religion you only take the loss of all the time and purposely seek out a bad state of life. The purpose of practice is to achieve a great result through undertaking small losses. If circumstances are such that there is no great fruit to be gained through taking a small loss, then you can, without any hatred, but with a motivation of compassion, respond in a strong manner. So Geshe Doga gave the example of someone who's walking with their partner in the street and someone moves to attack their partner. Geshe Doga says that it is appropriate to protect your partner in that circumstance. But as a bodhisattva, we're not going to do that at the same time as attacking the protagonist in a way that's going to involve the greatest amount of harm. We're simply going to intercede to a degree that will enable that situation to be diffused in the best possible way. We don't take out vengeance by smashing the person 50 times in the head with our boot until they're dead. We simply give them a swift kick to the groin so that they bend over in pain and we've got chance to move away. So these are great examples, and I think we have to think very practically. So the key, in other words, of this verse, what it means is that we're training in the practice of non-retaliation, the first kind of practice of patience, non-retaliation. Patience is one of the most supreme practices. It incorporates both benefit for and the intention of not harming other beings. With the practice of patience, says His Holiness, we are able to fulfill both our aims, worldly and spiritual. So the true mark of patience is that when someone weaker than us, no, I'll leave that for the moment, I think. So I'm going to get on to the other types of patience, but I'm conscious that we're going to run out of time. So this practice of patience is critical, and the story is often given in relation to this verse as well of a teacher who had a notoriously unpleasant attendant. I think some of us will know this story, who was so infuriatingly irritating to everyone that they were driven to go to a teacher, the great spiritual master, and ask him, why on earth do you let this man act as your attendant so that we all have to deal with him? And Atisha said that this man for him was the most precious attendant because he was the object of his practice of patience. So Atisha was deliberately keeping someone by his side who was challenging in order to continuously work at generating the precious mind of patience. So it's a really, really interesting example. So it's a way of radically reworking the situation. So I think we might stop the actual commentary at this point. We've got another 3 verses to go, and we've still got enough time in our other sessions to cover these. So I'd like us to consider here that, as Geshe Sonam Rinchen says in his commentary of the 8 verses, that learning to accept suffering as a bodhisattva trainee is like wearing an ornament. We wear the ornament of patience. Geshe Sonam Rinchen says, a practitioner of mind training learns how to wear suffering and difficulties as an ornament, as something which increases his or her inner strength and splendor. In order to bear physical pain, sickness, and other difficulties courageously, we need intelligence and the ability to reflect on the fact that since we have taken birth in cyclic existence as a result of contaminated actions instigated by the disturbing emotions, it is impossible to escape suffering in our present condition. So it's impossible, as Rinpoche said the same thing, didn't he, in this earlier quote? Although it's impossible to escape suffering in our present condition, it's not impossible to practice transforming suffering in the path to enlightenment. In fact, it becomes its most powerful catalyst. So accepting defeat, getting back to that very provocative notion, doesn't mean blaming yourself for things that aren't your responsibility, losing your self-dignity, or making yourself a doormat. It means letting go of having to be right, of having to have the last word. 3 scenarios. Think of a situation. Let's do this as a meditation. Become aware of our breath and ourselves in the present moment. Now think of a situation, a real situation, in which someone has insulted, slandered, abused, disappointed, or more generally, upset you. Now, as the meditator, consider how must the person's mind have been at that moment to make them act in that way. Were they happy? Recognizing that they were suffering, perhaps acutely. Let yourself forgive them and generate compassion, not just for them, but for everyone in their situation. Ask the question, what would happen if I accepted that I was wronged and let go of that resentment without retaliating or having the last word? Imagine accepting their harsh words with a calm mind without fighting back. Would you lose anything? Would I lose anything? Could or would it help the situation to retaliate? What would happen if instead of sowing bitterness, I sowed forgiveness? End the meditation. So that's a sort of a little experiential meditation, but it's certainly a very good one to think of when we're next in a situation like this in very practical terms. So we're going to return now at the conclusion of the session to the visualization of Amitabha on our crown. And we feel now that through sincerely attempting to approach the thought transformation teachings, that we might have gained some benefit. But to enhance this benefit, visualize the Buddha Amitabha dissolves into radiant light and descends into our crown. And as this energy permeates and reaches deeper, feel that we become inseparable from Buddha Amitabha's enlightened body, speech, and mind. Eshidoga, in his presentation of this meditation in relation to the 8 verses, suggests, and very importantly, that such a meditation is very powerful to perform at the time of death, especially if the time and circumstances of our death are unclear. So the further advantages of this practice is that though it will help us protect us from negativity in our lives, we'll be able to preserve or conserve a continuity of good conduct in whatever activity we do. So with that ensconced in our heart, I'm going to read 3 verses that His Holiness the Dalai Lama recommends as very powerful verses to recite while we're studying, well, not just while studying the 8 verses, but certainly while studying the 8 verses of thought transformation. And so this will also double as our dedication for the session together. With a wish to free all beings, I shall always go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha until I reach full enlightenment. Enthused by wisdom and compassion, today in the Buddha's presence, I generate the mind for full awakening, for the benefit of all sentient beings. As long as space endures, as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain and dispel the miseries of the world. So we also can make dedications for the long life of our precious teachers, and particularly His Holiness the Dalai Lama, without whom the precious teachings of thought transformation would not have arrived in the West. Think of precious role of Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Lama Yeshe, of course, and many other great teachers in this dissemination of these oral lineages to our ears. This living tradition has reached our ears. So with that, we conclude the session, and I think if we respond, our homework for the week is to cover 6 and 7, verses 6 and 7 in our commentaries, just to have a relaxed general read and to think and to jot down any questions that you might have while reading, so that they can be brought up in the session. So are there any final comments? So thank you everyone for spending the time together, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you, everyone, for joining.